The midday sun, a dusty street, a hand on the revolver's grip. You've seen this scene 1,000 times. Now imagine the first sign a cowboy sees entering town reads, "Surrender all weapons." This isn't fiction. Dodge City Ordinance Number 6 from 1878 completely prohibited carrying any firearms within city limits, a law stricter than those in many modern metropolises. How did the most heavily armed place in American mythology become a zone of total gun control? This paradox is just the first crack in Hollywood's facade. But Hollywood didn't just erase laws, it erased people. 1 in 4 cowboys driving cattle across the prairies was African American or Mexican. Why did a quarter of the real frontiersmen disappear from screens, replaced by fictional white heroes? And what do you think was the most common cause of death in the Old West? A bullet? No. Dysentery, pneumonia, and accidents killed tens of times more people than violence. So why is the entire myth built around the rarest cause of death, ignoring the real threats? By the end of this film, you'll receive 4 keys to the real history. These aren't just facts. They're a code that will allow you to hack the Hollywood matrix. In just 2 minutes, we'll start with the main symbol, the cowboy, and you'll discover why he was more a slave on horseback than a prairie hero. How did an icon of American freedom become one of the lowest-paid laborers of his time? The image of the lone rider, master of his own destiny, is a powerful cultural code. But the ledgers of 19th-century cattle companies tell a very different story. Hollywood convinced us this was the choice of free men, preferring adventure over dull city life. Their poverty appears as noble asceticism, a voluntary payment for freedom. However, the reality was an economic sentence. Cattle driving was exhausting seasonal work, often for food and shelter alone. A cowboy earned less than an unskilled laborer on a city construction site. But the deception runs even deeper. More than a quarter of these free heroes were recently emancipated African Americans or Mexicans. For them, it wasn't romance, but one of the few available and grueling jobs. The image of the white lone cowboy isn't merely an exaggeration, it's a deliberate erasure of entire social groups from history. The myth of the cowboy acts like a sieve. It lets through the bright stories of freedom, but traps all the mundane grit and economic dependence. The real threat to a cowboy on the prairie wasn't bullets, but something far more prosaic and deadly. What was the main threat to a man herding cattle for weeks across the endless prairies? Westerns unequivocally answer, bandits and horse thieves. Our imagination paints pictures of constant armed confrontations. Crime on the frontier certainly existed, and the work of lawmen was not easy. It seems convincing that the main drama of their lives revolved around conflicts with other people over a valuable resource, the herd. But the numbers shatter this picture. For every cowboy killed by a bullet, up to 100 died from pneumonia after an icy rain, dysentery from dirty water, lightning strikes, or falling from a horse during a stampede. The cowboy's main enemy was nature, not man. His daily battle wasn't for honor, but for survival in extreme conditions. This truth calls into question a key element of the myth, constant readiness for a fight. It also makes us wonder how often a cowboy actually used his weapon. Let's conduct a thought experiment. You're a cowboy responsible for a herd worth thousands of dollars. How often would you draw your revolver? The instinctive, movie-fueled answer, constantly. For protection, to demonstrate strength. It seems that in the wild prairies, a weapon was a guarantee of safety, an integral part of the job. But reality dictated otherwise. Firstly, ammunition was an expensive luxury, and wasting it without extreme necessity was economic folly for someone on a meager salary. Secondly, and most importantly, a loud gunshot could trigger a stampede. Losing or injuring cattle due to a single shot was professional suicide. Using a revolver near the herd was like lighting a match in a powder keg. It might solve one problem, but risk creating a catastrophe. Weapons were a tool of last resort, not an everyday accessory. But when they were used, it was nothing like the movies. Next, we'll dissect the anatomy of Hollywood's biggest lie, the duel. The picture clarifies. The historical cowboy was a low-paid laborer whose life was a grueling routine, with weather and disease as his main enemies. How did this image mutate into its complete opposite, a noble hero whose life revolved around gunfights? The first step in creating this myth came from cheap pulp novels, known as dime novels. Popular in the eastern U.S., they demanded vivid plots. Writers took real frontier figures and exaggerated them many times over, creating the first fictional heroes. However, these scattered stories were nothing compared to the true myth-making machine that put this process on an industrial scale. Dime novels merely laid the groundwork. The real Legend Factory operated on a clear formula, transforming history into a commercial product. We've addressed the real person. Now we'll uncover the fictional ritual. The next element of the code is Hollywood's biggest lie, the duel. Noon, Main Street, 2 gunmen. This ritual seems logical. In a world without a well-established legal system, a duel was a way to defend one's honor, demonstrate bravery, and establish order where none existed. This image of a noble confrontation, where the quickest and most accurate prevailed, became a cornerstone of the entire Wild West mythology. But the archives and newspaper chronicles of the time contain almost no such stories. Most gunfights were sudden, drunken brawls in saloons. Often they involved shots in the back, ambushes, or chaotic firing from a few feet away. Crime statistics from Dodge City archives show that the main causes of armed violence were alcohol and sudden bursts of anger, not the defense of honor. Survival was more important than any rules. A real gunfight was not a ballet of death, but a clumsy and bloody brawl. Most documented gunfights occurred at a range of 3 to 5 meters, 10 to 16 feet. Close enough to see your opponent's eyes and smell the gunpowder. This is precisely why the weapon technology of the time made a fair duel at a distance practically impossible. Now, let's take a closer look at this instrument. How was the Colt revolver, an icon of the Wild West, actually a terrible weapon for a beats? Duel? In movies, heroes effortlessly hit targets from dozens of meters away. At first glance, its reputation is deserved. The Colt Peacemaker was a powerful, reliable, and imposing weapon. It became a symbol of American expansion and personal defense, creating the illusion that it was a highly accurate instrument in the hands of a skilled shooter. However, ballistic tests reveal the truth. These revolvers had primitive, non-adjustable sights, a long and heavy trigger pull, and powerful recoil that kicked the barrel upwards. Even professional shooters today struggle to hit a man-sized target from 20 meters, about 65 feet. For someone under stress, it was almost impossible. This is why real gunfights happened at arm's length. It wasn't a duel, but a knife fight with firearms. Hitting the target was a matter of luck, not skill. Shooting a Colt Peacemaker from 20 meters is like trying to throw a rock and hit a coin. There's power, but accuracy is random. And the most famous example of this is the slaughter mistakenly called the gunfight at the OK Corral. What truly happened on October 26, 1881 in Tombstone, in an event that became the benchmark of a heroic showdown. In our minds, it's an epic battle where Wyatt Earp and his brothers dispense justice. The Hollywood version, based on Wyatt Earp's mythologized biography, presents a clear picture. Noble lawmen confronting treacherous outlaws. It's a clash of characters, good versus evil. It seems like the culmination of a long-standing conflict, resolved in a fair fight. Reality hit hard. According to eyewitness accounts and court records, the entire gunfight lasted about 30 seconds. It occurred in a narrow plot of land 5 to 6 meters, 16 to 20 feet wide. In those 30 seconds, about 30 shots were fired. It wasn't a duel, but a chaotic, panicked, close-range slaughter where people indiscriminately shot at each other. Wyatt Earp himself was likely unharmed only by sheer luck. The heroism was invented later in newspaper articles and memoirs. In reality, it was a group of frightened, angry people who engaged in a bloody melee. But if gunfights were so chaotic and deadly, how did towns manage to survive and thrive at all? So let's summarize. The noble duel is a myth constructed for spectacle. Real gunfights were quick, chaotic, and bloody. This leads us to the next logical question. How could towns exist under such conditions? Our minds, raised on Westerns, paint a familiar picture, a Wild West town where might makes right. At its center, a saloon full of drunken cowboys ready to draw their weapons at any moment. A constant threat, tension in the air, and a lone sheriff trying to maintain a fragile peace. It seems lawlessness was the norm. However, this image is the biggest inversion of the truth we've examined so far. Real frontier towns were not islands of chaos, but outposts of civilization and, more importantly, business. And business demands order, predictability, and security. That's why their residents and authorities desperately fought for legality. And their main tool in this fight directly contradicts everything we've seen in movies. It shatters the very foundation of the Wild West myth. Next, we'll uncover the best-kept secret of Dodge City and other lawless towns. The real reason for their success lay not in revolvers, but in laws. How did towns that became symbols of anarchy end up with laws stricter than modern ones? This paradox, stated at the very beginning, is simply explained if you view Dodge City not as a set piece, but as a business project. It was a trade hub, the endpoint for cattle drives. Its prosperity depended on bankers, merchants, and railroad companies, and business needs stability. Town councils passed ordinances prohibiting the carrying of weapons within city limits. Signs were posted at entrances. Sheriffs confiscated revolvers from arriving cowboys and stored them until their departure. Violators faced enormous fines. This wasn't ideology, it was an economic necessity. A drunken quarrel shouldn't escalate into a slaughter and scare off investors. City authorities acted like gardeners. They ruthlessly weeded out the chaos of armed conflict so the harvest of business could grow peacefully. But who enforced these strict laws? Was it really the noble sheriffs we know from the movies? What compelled people to become sheriffs in the Wild West? Movies answer simply, a sense of duty, a pursuit of justice. The image of the lawman is that of a knight, single-handedly confronting chaos. But why do historical documents paint a portrait of an ordinary civil servant? The job was dangerous, and legendary names like Wyatt Earp reinforce this illusion. It seems logical that the bravest would seek such a position. However, the reality was far more mundane. The sheriff's position was elected. It paid little and the risks were high. Often people with questionable pasts took the job. Former gamblers or even criminals who needed legal status. Their main task wasn't heroism, but routine, collecting taxes, enforcing court orders, breaking up drunken brawls. Marshal Wyatt Earp's duties in Dodge City included overseeing street cleanliness and collecting saloon license fees. So, cowboys were laborers, duels were fiction, towns were under strict control, and sheriffs were civil servants. Where then did the vibrant and cohesive myth we all know so well come from? Name 3 figures associated with the Wild West off the top of your head. Billy the Kid, Jesse James, Wyatt Earp. Why them, and not thousands of other people who lived on the frontier? The answer seems obvious. They were the most prominent figures of their era. Their stories were simply more interesting than the life of an ordinary farmer, and thus they endured in memory. We believe that history itself selects the most deserving. In reality, we know these names precisely because their stories were selected, embellished, and sold to the public. First in dime novels, then in theatrical shows. Their biographies were turned into sensations, often completely fabricating facts. We don't know those who were most important, but those whose stories sold best. As a result, we remember not history, but a carefully constructed media product. Our memory of the Wild West is a collection of 19th-century bestsellers, and very soon, we'll meet the chief architect of this grand deception. We've uncovered 3 layers of lies: the myth of the cowboy hero, the myth of the noble duel, and the myth of the lawless town. Each replaced mundane reality with a simple, spectacular cliché. But this main question remains unanswered. Who did this, and why? One might assume it was a natural process, folk art. That's how many legends are born. It seems this myth has no single author. However, facts contradict this theory. The creation of the Wild West myth was no accident. It was a targeted, brilliantly executed, and commercially incredibly successful project. A project to create a national legend that America needed. And this project had a name: William Frederick Cody, better known as Buffalo Bill. By 1900, more people had seen the Wild West in Buffalo Bill's show than had ever lived on the actual frontier. Next is the culmination of our investigation. We will expose the myth-making machine itself and see how one man managed to sell fiction to the entire world. How did William Cody, an ordinary Army scout and buffalo hunter, become the chief architect of the myth? His official biography is full of heroic deeds. It seems his fame was a natural consequence of his bravery. He simply told people what he had seen and experienced himself. This version portrays him as an honest chronicler of the era. But Cody was a brilliant showman. He was one of the first to understand that the real history of the Wild West was boring and unglamorous. But stories about the Wild West could be sold. He created Buffalo Bill's Wild West, a grand theatrical spectacle that toured the world. He hired real Native Americans and cowboys to play stereotypical versions of themselves. At a performance in London in 1887, Buffalo Bill performed before Queen Victoria, who was reportedly stunned by the thunder of gunshots. He didn't tell history, he packaged and sold it. His main talent wasn't in sharpshooting, but in marketing. But what specific techniques did he use to make fiction more appealing than truth? The secret of his show lay in a universal formula of 3 simple elements. The first element, heroization. Cody took real people, often with ambiguous reputations, and transformed them into one-dimensional heroes or villains. He hired Sitting Bull, Victor over General Custer, and had him simply ride into the arena to the cheers of the crowd. He turned people into characters, stripping them of their complexity. The second element, escalation. He took a real event, such as an attack on a stagecoach, and made it 10 times more dramatic. A common skirmish became an epic battle. This principle, taking a kernel of truth and building maximum drama around it, became Hollywood's gold standard. But the final and most important element, stereotyping. He created easily recognizable archetypes: the noble cowboy, the wild Native American, the treacherous outlaw. These clichés were understandable to any audience without explanation. It was this very formula that was completely copied by the nascent cinematography. But how exactly did this happen? Why didn't the first Western directors consult archives, but instead simply copied Buffalo Bill's show? It seems like creative laziness. Cinema was a young art form, and its creators sought ready-made popular storylines. But the reason runs deeper. Buffalo Bill's Wild West had already done all the marketing work. Over decades of touring, it had created clear expectations among millions of viewers for cowboy stories. It shaped the visual language, how heroes should look, how gunfights should unfold. Hollywood didn't need to invent anything. It just needed to point the camera at a ready-made formula. Over 50% of the plots of the first silent westerns were direct borrowings from Buffalo Bill's Wild West acts. Hollywood filmed not history, but a show about history. We are looking at a copy of a copy. This completely changes our perception of all the heroes we grew up with and forces us to ask, what remains when the myth crumbles? So, now we see the entire chain. At one end, the complex, mundane reality of the frontier. At the other, the brilliant Hollywood myth. And between them stands the machine for processing history into spectacle, launched by Buffalo Bill. What does this knowledge change for us? On the first level, it changes everything. The images we considered part of historical memory are, in fact, commercial products created for public entertainment. This realization might cause disappointment. But if we look deeper, this revelation opens up a new opportunity. It forces us to ask the main question: if all this is myth, what then is the true value of the Wild West? If the heroes are fictional, who were the real heroes? Now that we have all the keys, we will put them together. We will see what picture emerges when the smoke from Hollywood's revolvers finally clears. The Hollywood myth is not a collection of isolated fabrications. It's a self-sustaining system, where each lie makes another believable. It works like a stone arch. Each myth is a keystone that cannot stand on its own, but by supporting others, it creates an incredibly strong structure. To sell you the image of the noble cowboy, it needed a corresponding ritual, the duel of honor. For the duel not to appear barbaric, a backdrop was required: lawless towns where the law supposedly didn't function. This ideal narrative structure was packaged into Buffalo Bill's show and then copied by Hollywood. We have dissected 4 supporting myths of this structure, but this system of lies was created to conceal one simple, pragmatic truth. We started with a riddle. Why were gun laws in towns like Dodge City stricter than in modern Chicago? The answer is now obvious: economics. Dodge City was not a stage for dramas, but the endpoint of multi-million-dollar business operations. It was a logistical hub where investors from the East met cattlemen. Each herd of 3,000 head was an asset worth over $60,000. Chaotic shooting was a direct threat to capital. Therefore, authorities required weapons to be surrendered upon entry. The fine for illegally carrying a revolver in Dodge City in 1878 was up to $100, the equivalent of a cowboy's 3 months' wages. The myth speaks of heroism, where the revolver is a symbol of freedom. Reality speaks of business, where the revolver is a source of risk. Having lost the heroic tale, are we left with nothing? No. We have gained something far more valuable. The real feat of the historical cowboy wasn't a quick death in a gunfight, but months of grueling labor, battling weather and disease. His true enemy wasn't a bandit in a black hat, but a sudden night thunderstorm capable of causing a stampede and erasing months of work in 10 minutes. And this feat wasn't accomplished solely by fictional white heroes. Over 25% of these laborers, 1 in 4, were African Americans or Mexicans, whose faces you've never seen in Westerns. We trade cheap admiration for fictional gunmen for deep respect for the real builders. Their story isn't about dying beautifully, but about how hard it was to live. Now, 2 paths lie before you. On one side, a powerful and beautiful myth. It created iconic images and became part of a global cultural code. It's an influential story. On the other side, a complex and uncomfortable truth. It shatters idols, but returns to us the stories of millions of forgotten people and reveals the real mechanisms of society's construction. The choice is now yours. What ultimately matters more to you? A beautiful, inspiring myth that shapes culture, or a complex, uncomfortable truth that shatters it? Write one word in the comments below this video, myth or truth. Let's see what choice our community makes.